This game's really not made for kids. 3D platformers were really at their peak during the mid to late 90s. After almost a full generation of teasing the idea of 3D, the advancement of technology finally reached a point where consoles could render more than 5 polygons before blowing up onto your TV. Though considering how big they were back in the day, they could probably tank the hit. And while there were some solid early attempts at adapting platformers into the new dimension, it wasn't until Mario 64 came out that the genre really started to get the hang of things. And you probably know how the rest of the story goes. The Collectathon formula was an effective workaround for the limitations of the time, maximizing gameplay and minimizing file size, all while teaching players the wonders of hoarding. So naturally, taking inspiration from Mario, other developers wanted to try their hand at the new formula. From new IPs to old IPs, from licensed games to stuff you've probably never given a second thought, even more traditional platformers like Crash you could argue had Collectathon elements. They may not have been the most popular or acclaimed genre, but there was at least a healthy variety of them at the time. But as is the case with any genre, as it became more populated, tropes started to develop. And as the console generation came to a close, it became more clear that the genre was on its way out, soon to be replaced by the open world sandboxes and first-person shooters of the 6th generation. But in the dying breath of the 5th generation, there was a game that somewhat bridged the gap between these two trends, while also poking fun at the tropes of what came before. And obviously, you already know I'm talking about Conker. It's the kind of game that needs no introduction. He said after a 90-second introduction that is dubiously accurate at best, but even though I feel like a lot of people already know about this game in some capacity, I get the feeling that most people haven't actually played it before. Or at least haven't played it since Live and Reloaded's release at the earliest. So I'm going to put up a spoiler warning before I start talking about it, since it is the sort of game that's best enjoyed blind. Go play it if you're interested, it isn't very long and you'll probably have fun with it. I will give you a warning beforehand though, it isn't very good. Okay, when I say this game isn't very good, I mean that in the sense that it's clearly good at what it's trying to do. There's a certain creative vision behind Bad Fur Day that can be felt the moment you load up the game when Conker chainsaws the N64 logo in half. And while some people will find that vision horrible and disgusting, if you're watching this video, you probably already know if you'll like it. But the game holding that vision together is kinda actively painful to play, at least for me. And since I don't have much to say about it, we're gonna talk about it first. Or at least we're gonna try to? Because the difficult thing with this game is that even after playing it, I struggle to think about the gameplay in specifics. The only thing I really remember about it is that the controls suck ass. Everything feels so delayed, with slow wind-ups and wind-downs, to the point that the simple act of moving around this world isn't fun. And I feel like it's worth reminding people that this game closed the generation that basically opened with Mario 64, which doesn't make for the most flattering comparison, I'm sure you'll agree. And while most of the game is designed around these controls, with generally large spaces and the funny helicoptery tail thing letting you make somewhat precise jumps, the level design unfortunately has some quirks of its own. Any first-time playthrough of Conker is inevitably going to fill the player with a profound sense of, where the fuck am I going? Because in terms of collectathons, this game isn't structured how you'd expect. Normally, collectibles are used to bypass the main gatekeepers of progress, whether they be doors locked by magic or my future rug, and levels are unlocked by collecting a certain amount. But in Conker, basically every level is open right from the start, you just need to complete a sequence of objectives to unlock some of them. And collectibles don't start blocking your progress until about halfway through, and even shortly after that they stop being a factor altogether. Until that point though, it can be a little confusing figuring out where to go, especially at the start, because the chapters don't really feel like levels, since they're connected to the main hub pretty seamlessly and you can leave them at any time. I think the best advice I can give is just go about your day and complete whatever you come across, and you'll probably have a good time, which I'll admit was pretty novel once I got used to it. Unfortunately, at some point in that process, you'll end up needing to do a boss fight. And keeping in mind the problem I have with the controls, you'd think they'd make these fights almost unplayable. And thankfully that isn't the case, because they somehow made them even worse. Almost every boss uses a movement gimmick of some kind, which you usually learn about right then and there, meaning the delayed controls are now paired with not knowing how to move your character, and the combination of these problems creates whole new ways for me to yell obscenities at the screen. For the sake of time, I won't break down every boss fight, since most of them have problems of their own outside of the controls, but I don't think it's a coincidence that my two favorite boss fights are the one you fight on foot and the one where you actually get to use the gimmick before the boss fight. There are a lot of other very, very minor problems I have with the game, like this segment in the nightclub that quickly goes from a funny little minigame to a 20-minute long death march of terrible pissing controls. But I do want to defend the game real quick. The controls obviously suck for the most part, but the shooting controls are actually pretty good. Though this was back before Halo had standardized this sort of control scheme, meaning the left stick is used for aiming and the equivalent of the right stick is used for strafing. It takes some getting used to, but once you do, it works better than you'd probably expect, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who knows this studio's history. And while I think it's a shaky defense for the game, I do think that the problems may become less frustrating if you play it in short bursts. And once you've learned how all the gimmicks work, replaying the game with that knowledge may end up being more fun. The only reason why I didn't do either of these things is because I like recording longer segments of games for the ease of organizing my files. And come on, I didn't have fun playing the game to begin with. I'm not going to replay it right away. I'll come back to it once I remind myself what joy feels like. So it pretty much goes without saying now that Conker's a big old load of shit and it hasn't stood the test of time. But I also get the sense that was never the goal. I mentioned earlier that this game has a creative vision behind it that can be felt as early as the opening logos, and almost every aspect of the game feels like it's in service to this vision. Does it validate the gameplay problems? No, because while this vision is upheld from start to end, so are all of the problems I have. You shut the fuck up, mate. But there are plenty of games that I appreciate in spite of their terrible, awful gameplay. And I think giving those a free pass while hating on Conker is kind of unfair, especially since there is a lot to appreciate here. For starters, it has what is probably one of the most effective introductions to a game I've ever seen, even after Rare ensures Nintendo will never talk to them again. You have these ominous opening credits with dramatic music playing in the background before you're introduced to the title character, who's not in the best of headspaces right now. And while this is the first of many pop culture references, which I do have problems with, it's very effective at making you feel engaged right off the bat. Voice acting is also pretty good across the board, even when it isn't. Obviously not every character's performance is on par, but even in those cases, the bad performances do a lot to make even the most mediocre jokes funny. But the jokes themselves are kinda hit or miss. There were a lot more misses for me, but I think that's largely because I've already seen all of the cutscenes in this game about 3 times and I knew most of them were coming. But even if I hadn't seen them before, I think I would have been laughing more at how shocking it is rather than how good the jokes actually were. And I think that would have worn thin pretty quickly, since there are only so many times I can see a cartoon character explode into gore and say fuck before I start to get a little desensitized to it. But there are still some good jokes involving those things, even if I do think the jokes without them end up being a lot funnier. Oh yeah, something I forgot to mention back when I was writing the script. Conker is also representative of the timeless comedy format of, well, that just happened. And most of the fourth wall breaks end up following this format, which gets tedious immediately. To be fair, this was back before Marvel movies popularized this format, so it may have been more novel to see back in 2001. But it has caused a handful of the jokes to become more dated over time. I don't think they're as bad as their modern equivalents, but still, it's kinda tiring. Anyway, just thought I'd bring that up so I don't forget until after the video is published. But I think the biggest misses come in the form of pop culture references, which were novel to see, but most kind of fell flat for me. For context, I was born at the end of 2004, and this game references movies released between 1999 to technically 1939. I don't know if I should count that though, since it's the only movie from that long ago to be referenced, and the earliest movie after that is from 1971. And while I'm at least somewhat familiar with every movie on the list, I haven't seen all of them yet. To give you a better idea, taking the list from this video, here's every movie referenced in Bad Fur Day. Here's every movie I've seen, and here's every reference I could confidently single out. And after visualizing this list for myself, Jesus Christ, I think I need to watch more movies. And while I do get some of the more obvious references, like this one, it's a reference to Panty and Stocking, episode 5. I think the fact that around 2/3 of the list was flying over my head did end up affecting my enjoyment of the game somewhat. But that's not even really the problem I have with the references, since even some of the ones I didn't get still got a laugh out of me. It's more so the fact that it feels like most of the substance of the game comes from the references. This conversation at the end of the penultimate penultimate chapter about the horrors of war stood out to me as being weirdly profound for a game that made me fight an operatic turd 5 hours ago. But I asked my brother about it, and he said it's basically just lifted from Saving Private Ryan. And I don't know how much credit I can give to a game copying its homework like that. These references also impact the game's plot in a way that I'm not really sure how I should feel about. The early hours of the game have cutaways to the character who is technically the main antagonist, and pretty shortly after that, he basically exits the plot until the end to make way for poop jokes, which kinda gives me the impression that the plot doesn't matter. But then there's also the ending, which is super anticlimactic and tries to pull a profound message out of its ass at the last second. I don't know, I just think after that opening and the entire game leading up to this point, it would have been set up to hit harder when the player wasn't expecting it. But then the ending comes and it's like, yeah, let's reference Alien, and since we don't know how to get Conker out of this situation, let's reference the Matrix again, and I guess we'd better invent a theme. Yeah, that's good enough. But the theme itself of how it's always greener on the other side of the fence kind of falls flat too. Barry dying as abruptly as she does is shocking, yeah, but it doesn't feel like it's as devastating to either Conker or the player as the game thinks it is. These characters have only meaningfully interacted a whole once before this, and Conker was willing to cheat on Barry the first chance he got. And even if this wasn't the case, I just think the theme is a little juvenile for a game that opened by referencing a Clockwork Orange. Like, I don't know, am I missing something? Am I overthinking the implied emotional message of the pissing squirrel game? Because I've seen people praise this ending, and I don't mean to invalidate their perspective, just that I feel like we somehow ended up playing completely different games, and I got stuck with the one where I don't feel much sympathy for this asshole. Whining aside, I do still appreciate Bad Fur Day in some capacity. It's flawed in a lot of aspects, even in the stuff it does well, but it's also kind of the first and last of its kind. With how expensive game development is now, I don't see a decently sized developer putting in the time to make a game like this, where the people it would appeal to the most are too young to play it, where its ideas and inspirations are so all over the place I hadn't even heard of some of them before, where it just abandons its genre in the last quarter. And even if they did make a game like this, I think it would be trying too hard to appeal to too many people, and as a result it would end up appealing to no one. So even though I don't enjoy playing Conker, I do think there's value to it existing, and I do think most people should at least check it out. He said at the end of a video he started by dropping a spoiler warning. Yeah, I don't know, this video was supposed to be fairly quick to make, but then it ended up taking over a month to write because I struggled to think about the gameplay and specifics without getting actively frustrated. But fuck it, some people probably gonna watch past the spoiler warning anyway, so yeah, go play it for yourself, go have a good time. Anyway, I'm gonna go play Zelda 1 and complain it's aged poorly now. Dude, shut the fuck up, I'm trying to do voiceover.